Well, this is my first time doing a Zoom presentation, so bear with me. But thank you for having me. It's exciting what you guys are working on here, and hopefully nothing major happens, but it does. So we're going to go through with things. Disasters do happen. So I'm sure a lot of this may be repetitive, so I'm going to kind of go through some of this pretty quick. One of the biggest things is who, what, when, where, how, all that good stuff is very important, especially when you're dealing with a vendor. Knowing who they are, what they are, when they are, and then they need to know the same from you. So this all happens before. So you never want to call up a vendor like myself at the point of incident. Hey, James, what's going on? You're on our disaster plan and we don't know. So important that all these communications and contacts are made previous to the thing. So kind of who's in charge? Conservator, the business manager, CEO. You never know who's in charge. I don't know who's in charge when I show up, so you kind of have to let me know. First responders, what are their roles? Know your vendors, so who you're going to use, and ensure they know you. And I can't emphasize that enough, because we can't meet expectations if we don't know what those expectations are. You have the proper insurance, the proper coverages, an insurance carrier who knows what you have and the value of that, and what needs to be done to get it recovered. So what are some of the immediate actions we take? And we're going to talk about final expectations. It's never going to be like it was before. If it got flooded out or caught on fire, it's never going to be perfect again. Not from a disaster recovery vendor standpoint. Conservators do awesome stuff, but it'll never be exactly the same, whether it's a new binding or whatever else needs to get done. We're also going to talk about different methods of recovery that our industry offers. So So one of the big things is an immediate response. Kind of hard in Alaska, I get that, but you have to have a plan to be able to respond. So activating your team, whether that's internal within your organization, professional vendors like myself that do this type of work, how are you going to respond? So what are the immediately things that you want to do? Is it paper-based materials that you want to get frozen? How are you going to do that? Important type of information to think about before it happens. So expectations. Paper, once it gets wet, it's never going to go back truly to its pre-loss condition. Staining, paper clips leave rust. Clay-coated papers, even if I vacuum freeze dry them, they may stick together. But my biggest rule is garbage in is garbage out. So you give me something that's been in a basement for 40 years and it's all moldy, even if I dry it properly, it's still going to be moldy. So one thing is garbage in is garbage out, which is important. Some of our expectations when we show up, so safety requirements, things like that. So I had a client one time, roof collapsed because of snow weight. And he's like, okay, go in and get my stuff. But the building wasn't exactly completely safe. I mean, it was falling down. So we're looking for an engineer stabilizing the building so we can get in and get the materials that were important. So never just send in people a flooded building after a quick river flood or something like that, and the power's still on, somebody could get electrocuted. Just things to think about when you get there. Knowing where the priority parts of a collection are. I get calls all the time from libraries, and their biggest portion of their library that gets most activity is the children's books. But from a saving it and really having to save it perspective, children's books are not the priority. I mean, let's go for the irreplaceable historical collections and that type of thing. How are you going to stabilize the building? Does it need to be dried out? Do you need cooling because of the heat and humidity, things like that? Freezing the books. large quantities take a while. So I get clients all the time, they have 50,000 boxes, but 50,000 boxes didn't go in one day. It's going to take a couple days to get all that out. Most important thing though is to have your plan and then kind of go after your plan. So this is kind of one of our sites. This typical type of thing we run into all the time. You can see the water got up about 6 feet onto these record storage boxes. So we come in, we set it up, start packing it out, and then they go in the freezer trucks, which is the bottom right picture. So a lot of boxes, once they get wet, we have to rebox them, even to move them. So it's a lot of work to get things in and out. It may seem simple, but it's not. It takes a lot of labor. Here's another major flood that we get. A lot of hurricanes, river flooding, mud, all that stuff is going to be in the area. And the one picture there on the left, you can see where everything fell on the floor. How do you sort through that? How are you going to inventory, make sure you know what you're saving? We can save it, but if you can't find or identify that location of what that material is, how do you know you're getting it back in the right place? So we set up pack out teams. We go through, we work on inventorying everything. So we want to know what we're taking, and you want to know what you're giving. So if somebody's coming to take all your stuff that got damaged, you want to know what it is. You want to know what they took, things like that. It's really about safekeeping. And once you get into medical records and some other things, it becomes even more important because you got different laws and things that you have to follow through with. So when we try to do a document pack out, and this may be something that you guys in Alaska have to do on your own, because response from one of my competitors or myself is not going to be the first day. So you may end up doing a lot of this yourself on the front end, but identifying everything, having an inventory sheet, classifying it, the type and severity of the damage. Does it need to be dried? Is it just moldy? Was it fire damaged and wet? That type of information is going to be important to go through and find the accuracy. Regulatory compliance, if you're a medical facility and you have medical records, you have to follow the HIPAA regulations. So don't just send it out to a vendor without making sure you have a business partner agreement in place. Financial places, you have the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. So whatever you have, make sure that you're handling it properly with regulatory compliance. So one thing in our industry is we are not conservators. So we're a restoration company who specializes in drying and cleaning paper-based materials. But we are not the final step. So we're a portion of the process. We do quite a bit of the work, but we don't go into actually doing conservation type of work. That should be done by trained conservators and handled professionally. So these are all different types of things that we work on, from x-rays, which we don't see as much anymore with electronic medical records, legal documents, archives. We run into all kinds of different types of materials. So the type of paper is important too. Plain, clay-coated. Clay-coated paper, I'm never going to make a promise. I've had clay-coated paper books that one book, same book, volume 1, volume 2, one sticks and the other doesn't after drying. So if you have a bunch of National Geographic magazines, I suggest going to buy new ones, not wasting your money on vacuum freeze drying unless you can't get them anymore. Then it's worth a shot. So paper has a moisture content of 6 to 8%, and that's average. If you're in Houston, Texas, it's a little higher. If you're in Alaska in the middle of the winter, it's obviously going to be a little lower, but once you get above like the 10, 11% ratio, then it's pretty wet. So you got to dry it out. You can't, as us as humans, 90-some% water, we can't touch it and tell you if it's wet. I mean, we can tell you if it's soaking wet, but if it's in the at-risk area, you really need a paper meter to tell you what that moisture levels are. But I always suggest just vie on the safe side, and if it feels damp, make sure it gets dried out. So some of the things here. I don't know what the, I didn't do the research on the moisture contents in Alaska, but depending on where you are, it's going to vary. So Fairbanks versus Juneau, I'm sure it's a little different. So kind of know where locally, what your normal range is, and then shoot for that. So another thing that we run into is a lot of clean water losses. So pipe breaks on a sink. That's kind of a clean water loss. And then we also run in the category 3 or black water, which is sewage. So depending on the type of water and what the water has in it and for contaminants is another issue to have. So if you're going in to pick up a bunch of books that got damaged from a pipe break, a clean water break, it's not as more of a concern. If it was a sewage line that broke and it's all over the books and you want to save them, then you need to have your PPE, your masks, all that to protect yourselves when you're actually packing out these documents. So this is another one that we would ask what kind of water and how to get damaged. Last thing I want to know is it was a fire and they had asbestos in the building and I'm handling this stuff like it's not contaminated. So good to let us know what type of situation happened and what risks are out there. So I'm going to talk about some of the document restoration. So some of the ways of drying, we have air drying, desiccant air drying, vacuum thermal drying, vacuum freeze drying, freeze drying. So there's a lot of terminology in our industry. And I think it's important that you understand what the terms actually mean. Somebody who offers freeze drying or vacuum freeze drying, they're different processes. So you kind of want to know what you're buying. So we'll go through some of those. So for air drying, this is if you have a couple boxes that get wet and you have time, you can work on yourself. So normal room conditions, you're working in a conference room or a workshop and you're spreading it out and drying it. We've all spilled coffee on a piece of document and dried it out. So this is kind of something that we can do in-house and it works. So small quantities, you guys have all done this, moderately wet. If you have the space and the labor, if you want to control the security of the items, that's all, you can do this in-house. Quick turnaround too. Some of the cons, if it's clay coated paper, chances are it's going to stick together. I'll almost guarantee it. Once you get into more and more items, you're going to run out of space. You're not going to have the labor to be playing with it every day, things like that. So it's a very labor intensive process if you've ever done a good amount of this through the time. So one of the other ones that we offer and the industry offers is desiccant drying. So we will actually come to your site, build a room, bring in all the dehumidification equipment and control the room and actually can dry in a non-frozen state, but we can actually really facilitate drying out documents quicker in place. So we can do large quantities of this on site. Some of the Caribbean islands, we've done large quantities of this because the materials couldn't leave the island. So we'll go in and set up a situation like this. Another thing is accessibility, which from the cultural community, it's not as important, but hospitals and everything else who need access to their medical records, they may have to be able to get access to that medical record. This gives you that opportunity, and we can get through there. Photographs, x-rays, this is the preferred method that we go to. We don't do vacuum freeze drying on anything on a film with emulsion because it's going to pull it off. So clay coated paper is probably going to block again. Once you start doing a large amount of this, the finish quality is really dependent on the skill set of the staff. So our staff has been doing it a long time, but each document is basically handled several times a day, moving it around, kind of trying to keep it straight. It's a lot of time and effort involved. So freeze drying, if you have a freezer, you could throw something in. We've all thrown stuff in the freezer, a steak that we forgot that was in there, and it'll dry out over time. That to me is freeze drying. It's a self-defrosting freezer, and you can dry a book. I've seen clients leave a book in there for 4 or 5 years, pull it out and had it dried out. There's no commercial providers. We don't offer this, but it is an option, but that is freeze drying. So you freeze something and you're defrosting the freezer. That to me is freeze drying. Not vacuum freeze drying, but freeze drying. Vacuum freeze drying, and this is our chamber, which is in Texas, is actually when you take the documents, you freeze them. Before they go in the chamber, they're frozen. So we put them in from the day we pack them out, we'll put them in a freezer truck, then into another freezer, a blast freezer at our facility. It goes into this chamber frozen. So the chamber doesn't actually freeze the documents. It can, but you add 4 more days of wet material in the chamber before it gets to that point. And the goal of vacuum freeze drying is to remove the moisture from the materials as a vapor, not while it's a liquid form. So either frozen or a vapor, and then you pull it off, the moisture off the materials. So books, clay coated papers. I know this is becoming a little repetitive, but I don't guarantee anything. But if I had clay coated papers, this is definitely the way I'm going about it. So some of the negatives, limited to the capacity of the chamber. After some of the major hurricane seasons, me and myself and some of our competitors, we can be 6, 7, 8 months in backlog where items aren't going into the chamber because there's only so much room. There's commercially only so much space in these chambers. You really can't do these on site. We're not going to move that chamber, which is 60 feet long by 10 feet wide, and all the ancillary equipment. We're not going to put it on a truck and try to move it. It would just be cost prohibitive. One of the other things is you can over dry materials. So whoever's loading, if you had something happen and some things were just damp and other things were completely saturated, we always try to load the chamber with similar material. So all the saturated stuff goes in at one time, all the damp material goes in at another time, because if I dry completely saturated materials and damp, by the time my saturated materials dry, the damp materials are going to be over dry. And then you have the issues with not enough moisture in the paper. So this is a phase transition diagram. So you got the 3 phases of moisture. So solid, liquid, and gas. Once the incident occurs, it's obviously in liquid form. Our goal is to get it to the solid form and then keep it below the sublimation curve so it dries in the gas form. You never want it to get back to liquid because that's where all the damage is occurring. So that's that site. So best case scenario, worst case scenario, if you have things that are completely damaged, like on the right, it's going to take a lot of effort to get those back to looking like a good material. The ones on the left, you can see was just a light fire. I have a better chance of cleaning that up than the stuff on the right. So cleaning. So we can do cleaning. We do a lot of it. If we don't get into the conservation type of work, but if there's mold, dirt, fire, soot, all that, we'll sit there and clean. Our rooms we build HEPA vacuums and negative pressure in these rooms to protect our people. So we go about that. So it's really a page by page thing once you get into some of that stuff that's really damaged. So it becomes very costly also. I mean, it can take me up to 5-6 hours to do a box of really badly damaged materials. So some pictures here. When we talk about cleaning levels, we talk about level 1. So to me, I can't just say each box is going to be X if I get 500 boxes. So I kind of put it in the different levels. So level 1 is maybe some ceiling tile debris that fell down after a flood, real light cleaning needed. Level 2, you're starting to see a little more growth of mold, wet a little longer. Level 3, it's starting to get really gross. 4, lots of mud and other debris on the materials. Level 5, you got fire damage materials, lots of mud. So those are important to go after. That's how we in our industry price everything. We'll say there was probably 100 boxes of level 1, there was 200 of level 2, but kind of something that we need to take a look at when we get into everything. Then we get into disinfecting. So you can do gamma irradiation, which is a sterilization process. I've done this for bird guano. I don't really recommend it yet for permanent collections because we don't know the true effects of this long term. It hasn't been offered long enough to know what it does to the paper long term. But if it's the choice between bird guano remnants that may kill somebody and getting it gamma irradiated so it's safe to use and touch, it's a choice that you have to make when you run into an incident. We do a lot of digital imaging also, which is another option. If it's really bad and you don't need the original, but the information is valuable, you can scan. Shredding, which I don't think will apply much to you. But some of the things that you want to work on for making sure your response is success is obviously prioritizing those collections, making sure your most important collections get handled first and properly, developing a management plan. You don't want me to show up on site or any other vendor and I have 14 bosses because then I'm pulled in 15 different areas. It's crazy. So really when you're working with a vendor, make sure you have one boss. And because we don't understand political things within an organization and who's who, but you guys work all that out and let us know what the priorities are on our end. Have a way to refrigerate or freeze collections, which is important in Alaska because you may be 5-6 hours from something. Obviously, if it's the middle of the winter in Fairbanks, you could probably put it outside in a trailer or something and it'll freeze. But having a plan to get that done is so important because you send me something that sat wet in a liquid form for a day compared to something that sat wet for 2 months. But no vacuum freeze dry is going to reverse that extended damage from it not being frozen. If you get it frozen and I don't dry it for another 7 months, it really doesn't make a huge difference. But the longer it sits wet, makes a huge difference. You want to make sure you're protecting your undamaged collections from the issue, which happens more than I'd like. Had a flood in a library and they didn't do anything. And then all of a sudden you have a moldy collection throughout a library. So make sure you're drying the building or moving the undamaged collections and putting them somewhere safe. Hugely important. And inventory. So knowing what you're sending. One thing with a company like mine is if you have a book that's worth $5 million and you want me to dry it, it's not a big job for me, but the value of that book, I'm only going to have insurance that covers your materials up to the value of my contract. So if I charge you $1,000 to dry a $5 million book, you're out a lot if your insurance company isn't insuring it throughout the process. So something to think about. And also, if I take 400 books and you know you gave me 400 books, you want to make sure you get 400 books back. So that's why that inventory is so important. Time to prioritize a collection. If it's fiction books that you haven't seen and nobody's checked out in 10 years, time to clean house. This is the time. Which collections are most valuable? Can it be replaced? I just say be realistic. So don't give me 1,400 children's books because now you're going to pay more for me to process them than they're worth. So hugely important. Inventory we talked about, but we should agree at the end, your insurance company should know what you have. All very important. How are you going to protect it? So where are you getting your freezer from? The longer the paper remains wet, the more damage is occurring. So make sure that this is probably your most important thing to get to. Talk about pricing real quick. So if you call me up, hey, how much does it cost to dry a box of books? I'm going to give you that price. That's drying only. That doesn't include moving it, new boxes, any of the ancillaries. Some of the red flags, if you only get a drying price, boxes, my competitors only putting a couple books in a box and then you're paying for the whole box. Not clear on a drying technique. Oh yeah, we do vacuum freeze drying. Ask them a quick question. Oh, do you keep it below the triple point? If they don't know what you're talking about, they're probably lying to you and they're just going to air dry it somewhere. I don't work in the most, reputable industry. So there's if you every time there's a natural disaster, the governors get on and say, know who you're hiring. That's the reason why. So banker's box is, I don't know what size a banker's box is because a banker's box is a brand. It's kind of like Kleenex to tissues. So how big is the actual box? Everything's based on cubic footage. So it's good to know what the cubic footage is. What type of services are needed? The labor, the shipping, the scanning, the copying, all this type of stuff. What's the total price going to be? Don't just make a decision based on a drying price. Make sure you understand the whole process and what other costs are associated. So I know we're probably running out of time. I had a half hour, but we'll just go through these real quick. So these are some of our case studies that we've done. So here was a fire in a doctor's office. You can see the roof is gone, but all the files were stored so tightly that we could save them. Puerto Rico, sorry for the flashbacks, Lori. This was the view out of my hotel. That top of the building was gone. You can see somebody's kitchen there. This was a document storage facility in Puerto Rico. You can see all these daylights coming through the ceiling of the roof. All these boxes got wet. It was 125,000 wet boxes. Little bit of mold in a store. This store never actually got wet, but it just sat there without power and the humidity for so much that's the mold growth. This was a library in Boston that had a flood. They didn't do anything about the flood. Books never got wet, but they didn't dry out the library and you can see the mold growth, and we ended up having to go in and clean all those. Cedar Rapids Public Library, that was 6 feet of water through that library. The only thing we saved in this library, because it was so bad, was what they really had to save, which was some of their historical documents and things like that. So plan ahead, and that's why you're all part of this group, which is really important. But having a plan, knowing your team, knowing your contractors, executing that plan, because the biggest thing you can do is get things frozen quick. You get them frozen, we have time to figure out a way to dry them and everything else. So kind of covers it. If you have any questions.